The last time my Porsche 944 was on the channel, I was installing coilovers and taller tires. Since then, I've been chipping away at all the small stuff needed to make it a decent daily driver. I'm also going to be driving it down to Santa Cruz, California in a couple weeks, so this video will be a recap of what I've done in preparation for that. After the lift, the car obviously needed an alignment. The first shop I took it to told me the inner tie rods were bad, so that's the first thing we need to deal with. Removing the old ones is just a matter of breaking the outer tie rod end loose and then unthreading the inner end off the steering rack. To prep the new tie rod, the new boot needs to be installed, and we have to set the overall length as close to the old one as possible. It's going to get adjusted in the alignment process, but starting with the same length should at least make it drivable down to the shop. I'm just setting the new rod end at the same number of threads as the old one. Another thing to note is that the inner end has a small flange around the threads that's meant to be staked to the steering rack to prevent it from backing out. Once it's threaded on, a couple taps with a punch will bend that flange into a slot on the rack. Super easy, but important if you don't want your steering to come apart. Once the tie rods were in, an alignment shop was able to get it almost within OEM spec. Definitely close enough that I'm not worried about it. Something that 944s are kind of known for are engine bay fires. The fuel lines to and from the fuel rail pass over the exhaust manifold, and when they leak or burst, a fire can happen pretty easily. Since the lines in my car are original, I'm going to address that before I take it on a 1,500-mile road trip. There are lots of aftermarket options for this, but I bought some from Renbay. Installation of these involves cutting the OEM hard lines and adding compression fittings that adapt to the high-temp rubber lines. I'm also going to replace the short line from the rail to the fuel damper. This one is just an OEM replacement and fits exactly as you'd expect. With that done, I need to remove the supply and return fittings at the fuel rail and prep the hard lines for cutting. There's a tiny little pipe cutter in the kit, which makes that part pretty easy. The other end of this rubber line is attached to the fuel damper, so the length of the hose dictates pretty much where the cut needs to be. The return line just has a hose clamp on the other end and gets cut to whatever length works for your install. The main thing to be aware of is that you want these two fittings to be staggered slightly so they aren't constantly rubbing together in the wheel well. These fuel lines still follow the same path as the OEM lines, which is directly over the exhaust manifold. If they were much longer, I guess you could route them in a way that they stayed cooler, but they're made from better materials and they're not 35 years old, so I'm sure they're fine. Upon starting it up, there are no leaks at the fuel rail, so we're looking good. Just kidding. I failed to fully seat one of the compression fittings, which resulted in an immediate and substantial leak at the wheel well. Luckily, Renbei sent out some new compression fittings for no charge, even though this was 100% my fault. I'm a big fan of these guys for their good customer service. I popped that new fitting in there and now we're completely leak free and much less likely to burn the car down on I-5. And after inspecting the old lines, I probably should have done this sooner. The fuel damper line was already leaking a bit, and the rubber on the others looked pretty bad. Using up all the service life on old parts like this is kind of a theme with this car. You know what else is pretty cool for a road trip? A working odometer. This again is one of the classic 944 failure points that I think a lot of owners just kind of live with. There's a tiny gear deep in the instrument cluster that disintegrates over time, and it's kind of an intimidating repair. I'm here to tell you to just do it. Order that $22 gear, take apart your dash, and fix it. Getting to this point is literally just a matter of removing nuts and screws. Pulling off the speedometer needle is a little bit dicey, so be careful with that. I just pulled straight out and with a lot of force it popped off. I've also heard that this is threaded on and needs to be turned counterclockwise a few rotations, but I haven't been able to confirm this, so please don't blame me if yours breaks doing that. When it's down to this level, you can see the gear or lack thereof. Mine had disintegrated so thoroughly that its pieces were sitting in the bottom of the speedometer. Now we just have to take off all these tiny gears, add the new one, and reassemble. It was about this point in making this video that I realized I'm not exactly sure what I'm doing. Most of my videos that have been somewhat successful have been a step-by-step guide on doing something specific. For this video, I decided to add a bunch of smaller projects and not dive super deep into any of them, mostly because there are other resources for DIY 944 stuff. So yeah, I guess this is just a video log of what I'm up to with this car. Let me know if this kind of content is interesting to you. I really won't take it personally if it's not, but if it is, I can start sharing more of the general progress I make or do not make on my cars. I also had a jumpy fuel gauge that never read full and a non-functioning engine temp gauge, so now's a good time to address those. Both of them were fixed by simply pulling out these football-shaped terminals and cleaning them off. I'm also going to freshen up these light reflectors in hopes that it'll help the pathetically dim instrument cluster lighting. I cleaned off the old dull paint and used some of this on them. So now I have a working odometer for the first time in my 3 years with the car. According to the previous owner, it didn't work for the 10 years he had it either. He said he drove it pretty regularly, as do I, so I'm guessing that the 225,000 miles you see here is probably closer to 300,000 miles. Unfortunately, my lighting fix was a complete failure. I added some 3.8 watt halogen bulbs along with the cleaned up reflectors, but I don't think the paint is shiny enough. Unfortunately, I got sick and haven't had time to try anything else, so I'll have to deal with invisible gauges at night on this trip. I guess there are only so many small things I can do to distract me from the interference engine elephant in the room. The previous owner of this 944 told me that he had no knowledge of the timing and balance shafts being replaced during his ownership. If that's true, that means these belts are at least 13 years old because I also haven't touched them. The recommended service interval for these is between 30 and 45,000 miles, or 2 years. If the timing belt slips too much or snaps due to old age, the valves will hit the pistons and fairly catastrophic engine damage will happen. If I'm being honest, I deliberately didn't change the belts when I first got the car, even though that's what everyone who owns a 944 says you should do. I put it off because I figured if this 150 horsepower 4-cylinder blew up, it'd be a good excuse to swap in a turbo 5-cylinder. I'm now realizing that this engine is totally fine for what I want to do with this car, and doesn't deserve a catastrophic end due to my intentional negligence. Plus, it's going on 4 years since my Volvo has run, and trying to finish 2 engine swap projects at the same time in a 1-car garage sounds like a nightmare. So here I am, doing the most boring basic maintenance. I should be replacing the water pump too, but it seems okay for some reason. Maybe it's not as old as the previous owner thinks. The belts look pretty crusty, but the water pump, which usually gets replaced every 2 belt changes, spins freely with no noise or play in the bearings. And if for some reason you're watching this to learn exactly how to change a 944 timing belt, stop right now. Go check out NC944's channel. He has the most comprehensive collection of 944 maintenance videos I've ever seen, and is probably the reason that I'm not going to make anything like that. After a quick shakedown, and really the first time I've had the car on dirt roads, it's obvious that it still needs some stuff. Softer springs would help a bunch. Also, I'll put mud flaps on it before thrashing on it much more. The rock spray off the front tires is a lot for a shitty respray to handle. Luckily, none of that matters for a standard road trip, so I'll head down to California tomorrow morning.